She slapped me with her metal bracelet, right under the lobby camera, and my grandfather just smiled. "Don't cry," he whispered, tapping his cane 3 times on the stone floor. The glass doors slammed shut. The entire building went into emergency mode. 10 minutes later, in the 49th floor boardroom, he opened the safe, not for money, but to pull out something that could erase her entire career with one click. "My name is Nora Ellison. I am 29 years old, and I am, or perhaps was, the head of analytics at Granite Harbor Holdings. Our headquarters is a spear of glass and black steel piercing the perpetually damp sky of Grayford, a city built on old money and new data. Tonight, the rain was biblical, sheeting against the 40-foot lobby windows, turning the streets into slick, obsidian mirrors. It was 8:03 p.m., the cleaning crews were out, and the air was thick with the sharp, antiseptic smell of industrial floor polish, a scent that always reminded me of my stepmother, Vivian. Vivian is the chief financial officer of Granite Harbor. She is a woman renowned for her precision, her icy composure, and her love for all things clean. Clean balance sheets, clean server rooms, clean corporate narratives. She despised messes, and tonight I was a mess. I had been summoned from my 34th floor office via a one-word instant message. Lobby. Now, I stood before her on the polished granite floor. My nerves frayed, my report clutched in my hand. "This data is dirty, Nora," she said, her voice never rising above a perfectly modulated boardroom-level hush. It was the same voice she used to dismantle billion-dollar projections, and it cut just as deep. "The data is accurate, Vivian," I countered, my own voice tighter than I wanted. "The projections for the new logistics subsidiary are just unfavorable. The numbers reflect a high burn rate." "They reflect your team's inability to see the larger strategy," she cut in, stepping closer. The cold ozone of her expensive perfume washed over me, eclipsing the smell of the cleaner. "I need clean numbers for the pre-board meeting tomorrow. I need this problem scrubbed." "I can't change the underlying metrics. Vivian, that isn't analysis. It's fraud." The word hung in the vast, empty lobby. The night shift receptionist, a young man named Ben, suddenly became intensely fascinated by his keyboard, his shoulders hunching. Vivian's eyes, the color of a winter sky, hardened. "You," she whispered, "are my husband's sentimental project, a kiddo he saddled me with. But you are still just an employee, and this report is a mess." She raised her hand. It happened so fast I didn't even flinch. It wasn't a slap from an open palm. It was a calculated strike, a backhand delivered with the full weight of the heavy modernist metal bracelet she always wore. The sound was a sharp, ugly clack, like a spoon striking a porcelain cup, and it echoed. The metal hit my cheekbone, just below my eye, a sudden, blinding bolt of pain. Then, the heat, a slow, coppery warmth I instantly recognized. The air filled with a new scent, mingling with the floor polish. The faint, metallic tang from her bracelet, now smeared with a tiny trace of my skin. My blood. My eyes watered, a humiliating, involuntary response to the impact. And that's when I saw him. My grandfather, Graham Ellison. He was standing not 10 feet away, by the massive central pillar, half hidden in the shadow cast by the mezzanine. He must have been walking in from his private entrance. He just stood there, leaning lightly on his heavy polished walnut cane, the one with the carved wolf's head I used to trace with my finger as a child. He was watching. He had seen the entire thing, the accusation, the strike, the blood welling on my cheek. Vivian saw him too. She froze, her hand still half raised. A flicker of, not fear, but annoyance, crossed her perfect features. She smoothed her sleeve. "Graham, I was just handling a personnel issue. Nora was being hysterical. I waited for him to rage, to defend me, to do something." Graham Ellison, the founder of this entire billion-dollar empire, looked at me, his face as unreadable as the corporate bylaws he'd written himself. Then, he looked at Vivian. "And he smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was small, tight, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was the smile of a man who had just seen a complex equation solve itself. I felt the floor drop out from under me. He was siding with her. After all this, he was amused. "Don't cry," my grandfather whispered, his voice dry as old paper, though he was speaking only to me. Then, he did something I hadn't seen him do in almost 20 years. He lifted his walnut cane an inch off the floor and brought it down. 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was sharp, definitive, cutting through the lobby's quiet hum. It was a signal. My blood didn't just run hot. It ran cold. I remembered that sound. I was 7, at the Ellison estate, a sprawling fortress of stone and glass. A disgruntled ex-executive had bypassed security and was screaming in the foyer. My father was panicking. Graham had simply walked to the top of the stairs and tapped his cane 3 times. Every door in the house, every window, every gate, sealed with the heavy thud of magnetic locks. The house went from a home to a vault in 3 seconds. He had frozen the entire estate. Now, in the lobby of Granite Harbor Holdings, the same thing happened. A soft, electronic ping chimed from the internal speaker system, a sound usually reserved for fire drills. But this was no drill. The massive, silent, revolving glass doors at the front entrance shuddered to a halt, their motion arrested mid-spin, with a heavy pressurized hiss, magnetic locks engaged. The doors were no longer an entrance. They were a solid wall of reinforced glass. The secondary swing doors locked simultaneously. We were sealed in. "What in the hell is this?" Vivian snapped, her composure finally breaking. She rounded on me, thinking this was somehow my doing. "Another one of your system-wide stress tests?" She grabbed my wrist, her cold fingers and the hard edges of her rings digging into my skin. "You will unlock this building, now." Before I could even speak, a crackle of static burst from the security guard's radio at the reception desk. Ben, the receptionist, was pale, his hand hovering over his console. All stations, all stations." A calm, professional voice echoed from the radio. "Protocol Alder is initiated. E-level command. Secure the perimeter. No ingress, no egress. Protocol Alder is active." Ben looked up, his eyes wide, not at Vivian, but past her, at my grandfather. Vivian finally seemed to understand this was not a drill. She let go of my wrist, her eyes narrowing at Graham. "Graham, what is the meaning of this? Is this a security threat?" My grandfather just stood there, that terrible, knowing smile still playing on his lips. His eyes were half closed, as if he were merely an uninterested party, a bystander enjoying a moment of bizarre corporate theater. But I'm an analyst. My entire career is built on finding the one data point that doesn't fit, the small signal hidden in the avalanche of noise. And I saw it. As he rested his weight on his cane, his thumb brushed a small silver inlay just below the wolf's head, on the very tip of the cane, where the rubber ferrule met the polished granite. A single, tiny pinprick of light flashed. It was a deep, impossible green. Blink. It wasn't just a cane, it was a command, and it was recording. The rain hammered against the glass prison of the lobby. Vivian, the most powerful woman in the company, was locked inside with me, a terrified receptionist, and a silent old man who had just watched his granddaughter be assaulted and done nothing but smile. He hadn't come to save me. He had come to use this. The trap wasn't for me. It was for her. And she had just walked right into it. "Protocol Alder." The words, spoken by the disembodied voice on the radio, still hung in the air, heavy and cold as the granite pillars around us. Vivian's fury was a palpable thing. It radiated off her in waves, tightening the air. She finally let go of my wrist, leaving a perfect imprint of her fingers. "A protocol?" "Graham, what is this childish game? Is this a drill? This is highly irregular and disruptive." My grandfather ignored her. He was looking at me, his eyes no longer smiling. They were neutral, Analytical, the small green light on his cane, having broadcast its signal, was dark. This was always her weakness. Vivian, the financial savior, detested anything she couldn't control. She had arrived in our lives 17 years ago. A whirlwind of razor-sharp suits and impenetrable financial jargon. Sweeping into the vacuum my father's death had left, I was 12. My father, Graham's only son, was the heart of the company, but not its brain. He was kind, charismatic, and had a terrible head for numbers. He'd left a sentimental void and a very real, very messy pile of mismanaged debt. Vivian, his wife of only 18 months, was not a grieving widow. She was an opportunist with a solution. She didn't mourn. She consolidated. She restructured the debt, liquidated failing assets with surgical precision, and within 2 years had presented the board with a recovery plan so brilliant, so clean, that they had no choice but to make her chief financial officer. She had saved Granite Harbor, and she never, ever let anyone, least of all me or my grandfather, forget it. In the lobby, the silence of the locked-down building was deafening. The elevators are offline. Ben, the receptionist, stammered from behind his desk. His face was pale. All keycards are suspended, except E-level overrides. Vivian let out a sharp, impatient sigh. I am E-level. She strode to the executive elevator bank, the one reserved for C-suite and the board, and slammed her platinum CFO access card against the reader. The light, usually a permissive green, flashed an angry, definitive red. Denied. She froze. For the first time tonight, I saw a crack in her composure, a hairline fracture of genuine panic. She turned, her voice losing its polished edge. Graham, my grandfather, Graham Ellison, had founded this entire empire from a single quarry and a ruthless understanding of logistics. He had built half of Greyford's skyline, but for the last 10 years, he had been chairman emeritus, a ghost, a figurehead rolled out for annual galas and shareholder meetings. He attended board meetings, of course, but he always sat in the back, away from the main table, observing. People forgot. They forgot that the man who invents the game also writes the rulebook. They mistook his silence for absence. While Vivian was building her throne on the 49th floor, I had come in through the basement. I started 7 years ago as a data intern. Nora Ellison. The name was a liability, not a privilege, so I didn't use it. I was just N. Ellison on an email signature. I was one of 20 interns in a windowless room, cleaning data sets at 2 a.m, fueled by stale coffee and the hum of the servers. I built the back-end reports that no one else wanted to build. I tracked shipping efficiencies, vendor integrity, fuel cost fluctuations, and server latency. I was the ghost in the machine, the anonymous analyst whose charts and deviation warnings eventually made their way up the food chain, landing on Vivian's pristine desk every morning. She would take my findings, reformat them into her own strategic insights, and present them as proof of her meticulous oversight. I didn't mind. Anonymity is a form of armor. While she was managing perceptions, I was learning the building's true nervous system, not the organizational chart, but the data flow. I knew where every dollar, every byte, and every lie was routed. When I finally earned my promotion to head of analytics, I was too visible to be anonymous, so I became a target. That's when the public condescension began. In executive briefings, if my team presented a forecast that contradicted her narrative, she would adopt a tone of patronizing warmth. That's a very diligent effort, kiddo, she'd say, sometimes even patting my shoulder in front of the VPs. But let's look at the real macro environment, shall we? She used the word kiddo to remind everyone that I was a child. My father's daughter. Sentimental, inexperienced, a girl playing at a grown-up's table. Behind the scenes, it was quiet, brutal warfare. In January, she would sign off on my team's ambitious new KPIs. In March, just as we were hitting our stride, she would quietly reroute server priority to her own special projects, starving my analytics engines of the processing power we needed. My team would work twice as hard, pulling all-nighters, only to miss our targets by a fraction of a percentage point. Such a shame, Nora. She would sigh in my performance review, her face a perfect mask of disappointment. Your team just doesn't seem to have the grit. Perhaps you're not pushing them hard enough. She was strangling my department with invisible hands, all while smiling and talking about synergy. In the lobby, she was still looking at me as that kiddo. Her panic was already receding, hardening back into arrogance. This was a technical glitch. This was Graham, pulling a senile prank. This was something she could control. Graham, your little game is over, she snapped. Call off security, now. It's not my game, Vivian, my grandfather said. His voice was quiet, but it seemed to echo in the vast, sealed space. It's yours. You just forgot the rules you wrote. Everyone in this building thought power resided on the 49th floor. In the corner office with the private elevator, they thought it was the platinum access card, the title, the multi-million-dollar bonus. They were all wrong. Real power at Granite Harbor Holdings wasn't a title. It was the original corporate bylaws, bound in heavy blue leather, locked in a fireproof, climate-controlled safe in the sub-basement records room, and, as I'd discovered during a late-night data mining project on our own legal archives, power also resided in the crimson wax seal of a very specific, very old safe that wasn't on any official floor plan. I remembered the board meeting 3 years ago. I was in the back of the room, running the presentation slides, a glorified intern with a security clearance. Vivian had proposed a series of minor amendments to the corporate emergency protocols. Just housekeeping, gentlemen, she'd chirped, smiling at the nodding, complacent board members. Streamlining our response capabilities, giving the C-suite officers the authority to act decisively in a crisis without being hampered by outdated bureaucratic notification procedures. It was Bylaw 17. The new subsection, 17B, gave her, as CFO, unprecedented and unilateral control over financial assets, data repositories, and communications systems in the event of a system-wide integrity failure or an immediate physical threat. She was, in effect, giving herself the authority to become a dictator during any lockdown she deemed an emergency. The board, lulled by a decade of record profits and her confident smile, barely skimmed the fine print. They voted yes unanimously. I watched my grandfather. He sat in his usual chair, against the wall, away from the polished mahogany table. He didn't object. He didn't raise an eyebrow. He didn't ask a single question. He just watched her. As she spoke, he made a single, small notation in the leather-bound journal he always carried. That was all. It was in that moment I truly understood. I had spent my career listening to what people said, analyzing the data they produced. My grandfather had spent his entire life analyzing their silences. I learned, from him, to memorize the things powerful people choose not to say. He hadn't objected, I realized, because he didn't need to. In her arrogance, in her rush to build her own fortress, Vivian had just handed him the weapon to destroy her. She had built the perfect cage and, in her haste, had given him the only key. A sharp, clear ding suddenly cut through the lobby. It wasn't one of the main elevators. It was the private, fire service elevator, tucked away in an alcove, the one that bypassed all keycard systems and ran on its own generator. Vivian spun toward the sound, her body tensing. The stainless steel doors slid open with a pressurized hiss. 2 men in dark, severe suits stepped out. They were not company men. They had the aura of external counsel and forensic auditors. They were followed by 2 uniformed, E-level corporate security officers, the internal rapid response team, the ones who handled executive terminations and data seizures. The lead counsel, a man with cold eyes and a tablet in his hand, looked at his screen, then at Vivian. Ms. Ellison, Protocol Alder has been invoked. By whose authority? Vivian demanded, her voice shaking with rage. By the authority of the Chairman Emeritus, the man read, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Activating Bylaw 14A, Crisis of Confidence in Senior Leadership. Vivian actually laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound. Bylaw 14, that archaic clause, that was superseded by my amendments, by Bylaw 17B? The lawyer looked up from his tablet, a flicker of pity in his eyes. No, ma'am. Bylaw 17B is triggered by the activation of 14A. It doesn't supersede it. It seems you misread the dependency clause. The fine print, the tiny bureaucratic words she had skipped over in her hurry to grab power. My grandfather stepped forward, his cane making no sound on the plush carpet runner that led to the elevators. Vivian, you wanted to scrub the data. You wanted everything clean. I agree. He nodded to the lead security officer. Please escort Ms. Ellison and Ms. Ellison to the catalyst room. The emergency committee of the board is convening. Vivian was trapped. She was locked in a building by the very emergency protocol she had designed. And tonight, all the fine print she wrote, and all the dirty data I had spent years collecting, was about to be read, very, very loudly, to everyone who mattered. The service elevator was a pressurized steel box, silent except for the faint, high-pitched whine of the motor. It was designed for emergencies, bypassing all standard floors, a straight shot to the executive level. The air inside was cold, recycled, and smelled faintly of ozone. We stood in a forced, terrible intimacy, me, my grandfather, Vivian, and the lead counsel, a man whose face was a mask of professional neutrality. Vivian was rigid, her back ramrod straight, her knuckles white on the handle of her leather portfolio. She was staring at the illuminated 49 above the door, as if she could force it to arrive faster through sheer willpower. She was vibrating, a human power line thrumming with contained lethal rage. I kept my hand pressed to my cheek. The skin was hot, swollen, and sticky. The throbbing was a dull, heavy bass line to the adrenaline screaming in my ears. I kept replaying the moment in the lobby. The clack. It was such a precise, inorganic sound, not the fleshy impact of a human hand, but the sharp, brittle sound of metal on bone, like a heavy silver spoon striking a delicate glass cup. I could almost hear the microfractures forming. My blood was a hot, sudden reality on my face, but in that same instant, I had seen the tip of my grandfather's cane pressed against the cold, white granite of the lobby floor. It was a study in opposites, my hot, messy, humiliating pain, and his cold, polished, absolute control. Now, in the elevator, I looked at that cane. He was leaning on it lightly, his hand resting over the carved wolf's head. The silver inlay of the wolf's eyes seemed to glitter. I had seen the light in the lobby, just after the third tap, a single, subversive blink of emerald green from the ferrule at the base. It wasn't a status light, it was a confirmation. I am a data analyst. My life is a search for signals in noise. I had seen the manifests for R&D special projects, the ones funded directly from the chairman's discretionary budget, the ones Vivian always complained about as vanity expenses. One of them was a senior executive discrete signaling and evidentiary device, a prototype. The wolf's head wasn't just a carving, it was a high-fidelity, multi-directional microphone. The 3 taps on the floor weren't just a theatrical signal to the guards. They were a digital command, an encrypted, high-frequency burst broadcast from a transmitter embedded deep in the walnut. The green blink meant the signal was sent and received. Protocol Alder. I had seen the term in server logs. I'd always assumed it was a standard lockdown procedure. Fire, shooter, chemical threat, steel doors, airlocks, call the police. I was wrong. I was so profoundly wrong. The protocol wasn't about keeping people out. It was about locking them in. As the elevator climbed, the truth assembled itself in my mind, piece by agonizing piece, like code compiling. I remembered the architectural blueprints from the last server migration, the main lobby, the executive floors, the boardrooms, They were all flagged for asynchronous AV redundancy. The large, obvious dome-shaped security cameras in the lobby, the ones Vivian and I were standing directly under, they were decoys. They fed the low-resolution, 24-hour loop to the main security hub, the one monitored by the night shift. Protocol Alder did the opposite of what anyone would expect. It shut down the fake cameras, and it activated the real ones. Where? The elegant, smoked glass panels that lined the lobby, the massive, floor-to-ceiling mirrors that reflected the Grayford skyline, the heavy, gold-framed abstract paintings in the boardrooms. Two-way mirrors, all of them. The entire executive wing wasn't just an office, it was an observation deck, a soundstage. And the audio, my God, the audio. My grandfather hadn't just recorded the slap with his cane, he had activated everything. In every elevator, in every C-suite office, in every critical meeting space, the tiny, flush-mounted sensors in the LED ceiling lights, the ones we all thought were for climate control, were state-of-the-art microphones. At the exact moment he tapped his cane, every single one of them had switched from passive to active. They weren't just recording, they were streaming, feeding a live, time-stamped, encrypted signal directly to the legal evidentiary servers in the sub-basement. The archival redundancy servers my team had been instructed to deprioritize, to ignore as legacy hardware. The entire 49th floor was, at this moment, a legally admissible wiretap, and my grandfather held the only key. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. His smile. That small, tight, terrible smile in the lobby. He hadn't been smiling in amusement at my pain. He had been smiling for her. It was bait, pure, simple, and absolutely lethal. He knew Vivian's arrogance better than anyone. He knew she saw him as a relic. He knew that if she believed he, the patriarch, was either indifferent to her cruelty or too senile to act on it, she would feel invincible. She wouldn't just be arrogant, she would be careless. And she had been... I remembered her words, hissed at me in the seconds after the slap, while my grandfather was still just watching, while she was fixing her cuff, confident in her dominance. "He's an old fool," she'd sneered, her voice low, for my ears only. "And you're just hysterical data. No one will ever believe you. No one will ever believe you." She thought she was speaking in a cone of silence, a private dismissal. In reality, she was testifying against herself in high-definition video and crystal-clear audio. She had provided the motive, the context, and the proof of intimidation, gift-wrapped for a legal team. She had taken a simple case of workplace battery and escalated it, on her own, into executive malfeasance. The elevator chimed, a soft, expensive ding. The doors slid open onto the 49th floor. The air up here was different, colder. The lights, usually a warm, welcoming white, were now a brighter, harsher, blue-toned white. The crisis lighting grid. It made the Italian marble floors look like a sheet of ice. The floor was empty. No late-night analysts, no cleaning crews. Just a long, silent corridor stretching toward a set of massive frosted glass doors at the far end. The catalyst room, the main executive boardroom. Vivian stormed out of the elevator, her heels striking the marble with sharp, angry clicks. Clack, clack, clack. She was radiating fury. She still thought this was a bureaucratic nightmare, a technical failure she would pin on some hapless IT manager. I followed, my own footsteps silent in my soft-soled shoes. My cheek was on fire. The lead counsel and my grandfather fell into step behind me. 2 uniformed E-level security officers, the internal rapid response team, were waiting for us. They didn't speak. They simply flanked us, one in front, one behind, guiding us down the long hall. It was a walk of shame, but I wasn't sure whose. As we reached the frosted glass doors, my grandfather did something almost imperceptible. He was on my left, and he raised his left hand, the one not holding the cane, and slowly, deliberately, adjusted his silver cufflink. A simple, elegant movement. It was another signal. The lead guard, the one walking point, saw the gesture. He didn't turn. He simply tapped his earpiece. The massive frosted glass doors of the catalyst room hissed open before we reached them, sliding smoothly and silently into the walls. Vivian stopped dead. She audibly gasped. The room was not empty. The long 30-foot table of polished black mahogany was lit, but not for a presentation. At the far end, sitting side by side, were two people. Helen Carmichael, head of the Audit Committee, David Renway, head of the Ethics and Compensation Committee. The two most powerful and most feared members of the Board of Directors. They were not on a conference screen. They were here, in person. At 8:17 p.m. on a rainy Tuesday, their faces were grim. In front of them were two leather-bound portfolios and two glasses of water. They had been waiting. Vivian's rage evaporated, replaced by a sudden, visible, icy dread. Her face went pale, a stark, chalky white that made the red of her lipstick look garish. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't a technical error. This wasn't a drill. This was a summons. This was an ambush. The lead security guard stepped forward and held the door open, a gesture that was both polite and non-negotiable. "The catalyst room is ready," he said, his voice a flat, formal monotone. I looked from the board members to the dark, massive 8K video wall that covered the far side of the room, and then to my grandfather. He met my gaze. His eyes were not cold, not amused. They were settled, patient, the eyes of a man who had set a very complex, very precise trap and had just heard it snap shut. He hadn't come to the lobby to comfort me. He hadn't come to scold her. He hadn't stumbled into a family drama. He had come to end a very, very long game. He just needed his opponent to make the final, incriminating move, and I, with my bleeding cheek and my dirty data, had been the perfect, willing, final piece on the board, the pawn that checkmates the queen. The catalyst room was silent. It was a cold, high-tech cathedral of corporate power, all black mahogany, brushed steel, and a single massive 8K video wall that was currently dark. The air was chilled, scrubbed clean of any human scent. Helen Carmichael, from Audit, and David Renway, from Ethics, stared at us from the end of the long table. They did not stand. They looked like judges who had already heard the pretrial arguments. Helen, David, Vivian's voice was strained, a poor imitation of her usual boardroom command. "I assume you're here for the pre-briefing tomorrow. Graham, this is wildly inappropriate. You've triggered a false alarm, terrorized the staff, and locked down the entire building." She tried a brittle laugh. "All for, what, a family squabble? I must insist you stop this." "Sit down, Vivian," Helen Carmichael said. Her voice was flat, carrying the absolute authority of the Audit Committee. It wasn't a request. Vivian sat. Her arrogance, her shield, was gone. She just looked small. My grandfather ignored her protest. He walked past the long table, his cane silent on the plush carpet. He moved toward the far wall, a seamless expanse of polished rosewood paneling that was supposed to be purely decorative. He pressed his hand against a spot that had no visible button or seam. There was a faint hiss of hydraulics, a perfectly cut square of the rosewood paneling, 3 feet wide, slid silently sideways, revealing a flush-mounted, biometric safe, its steel face gleaming under the harsh crisis lights. Vivian's head snapped toward it. That's not on any schematic." "No," Graham said quietly. "It isn't." He placed his right thumb on the glowing green scanner. A heavy, satisfying thunk echoed in the room, like a bank vault's bolt retracting. He pulled the heavy steel door open. My first thought was, it's empty. There was no cash, no gold bars, no glittering jewelry, no bearer bonds. It was clean, organized, and terrifying. It held only documents and data. It wasn't a safe for wealth. It was a safe for ammunition. He reached inside and withdrew a single, thin, archival box. It was sealed not with tape, but with a thick, brittle, dark red wax, stamped with the old Ellison family crest. He cracked the seal with his thumbnail. "You are very proud of Bylaw 17B. Are you not, Vivian?" he said, sliding the document out. "Your Emergency Powers Amendment." "It was passed by the full board," Vivian said, her voice recovering a fraction of its strength. "It's ironclad." "It is," Graham agreed. He laid the paper on the table. "Except for the codicil you never read. The original charter's founder's prerogative. It states any amendment that attempts to supersede the authority of the chairman emeritus in a time of moral or financial crisis is rendered null and void. You built a very impressive house, my dear, but you forgot who owns the land." Helen Carmichael slid a copy of the original charter across the table. Its Section 4, Subclause A, Ms. Ellison, the moral crisis was triggered at 8:03 p.m., in the lobby, under advisement of counsel. My grandfather reached back into the safe. He pulled out 2 more items. First, a thick stack of papers, bound in simple blue. "Proxy votes," he said, dropping them on the table. "From the Peterson estate, the Ohio Teachers' Pension Fund, the Swiss investors, all the silent partners you've been ignoring for a decade. They've been voting with me, in trust, for 5 years. I hold a 54% majority, effective immediately." The second item was a single, heavy, silver USB drive. It was engraved with 2 simple letters, G-E. Vivian's eyes darted from the proxies to the USB drive. "Data," she scoffed, a desperate, hollow sound. "More of Nora's dirty data, I suppose. Fabrications, hearsay, you have nothing." "Not nothing," my grandfather said. He pulled one last document from the safe. It was laminated. This one is personal." He slid it in front of me. I looked down. It was a signature analysis, a forensic comparison. On the left was my father's signature from his will, the one Vivian had executed. On the right was a signature from a different document, a private letter, notarized and dated 10 years ago, just before his last trip. It was a dead-hand provision, a letter written by a man who knew his new wife better than she thought. It authorized Graham Ellison, and only him, to take temporary and absolute control of his shares and his board seat in the event of gross corporate abuse, fiduciary fraud, or personal malfeasance by Ms. Vivian Ellison. It was specific, it was vindictive, and according to the forensic report attached, it was undeniably his. "He was sentimental," Graham said, his voice soft. "But he wasn't a fool." Vivian looked as if she'd been struck again, this time by a ghost. "And finally, my grandfather said, the audit." He nodded to Helen Carmichael. She opened her own portfolio, which I now saw was identical to the box from the safe. 3 years ago, Helen said, her voice a monotone, an anonymous intern filed a complaint about vendor payment discrepancies. The complaint was resolved by your office, Vivian, logged as a clerical error. My blood ran cold. I remembered that. A quiet analyst in the cube next to me. He was gone a week later. That intern, Helen continued, was not an intern. He was a junior forensic investigator from an external firm, hired by the chairman emeritus and placed by us. For the last 36 months, we have had a team embedded. For a while, one was on the janitorial staff for this very floor, Project Nightingale. She laid a bound report on the table. "We know about the shell companies. Vivian, the ones registered in Delaware and routed through the Cayman Islands. We saw your cash flow optimizations. Very clever. Moving fractions of percentages, skimming from vendor overbilling, all funneled into consulting fees paid to a holding company, VH Global, which you control. We've been watching you scrub the books for years," David Renway added, his first time speaking. "The only thing we lacked was motive, an explanation for the recklessness, a clear-cut violation of the moral turpitude clause, something undeniable." My grandfather looked at me. The pieces were all on the table, the legal authority, the voting power, the financial evidence, and the motive. "Vivian has always said your data was dirty." "Nora," he said. "She was right. It was full of her filth. He slid the heavy, silver G drive across the polished black table. It glided silently, stopping perfectly in front of my keyboard. Vivian was staring at it, her white-knuckled hands flat on the table. "Don't," she whispered. "This is a privileged board meeting. Whatever is on that, it's inadmissible." "It is an official exhibit of the audit committee," Helen snapped. My grandfather never took his eyes off me. The small, angry throb on my cheek was a metronome, counting down. "You press it, Nora," he said. His voice was a command. My hand was shaking, not from fear, but from a cold, clarifying rage. I picked up the heavy silver drive. It was cold, solid. I stood, walked to the head of the table, and slotted it into the master console. The 8K wall, dark as a dead eye, flickered to life. It wasn't a spreadsheet. It wasn't a document. It was a live, interactive dashboard. It was my system, my analytics platform. But it was a version I had never seen, a God view mode. The screen split into quadrants. Top left, an audio file. A waveform pulsed. Vivian's voice, amplified, filled the room. "I don't care about the risk assessment. Bury that projection. Find me a new model, or I'll find a new analyst." It was the threat she'd made to my predecessor, the one who resigned for health reasons. Top right, an email chain. Vivian to an external vendor. "The invoice needs to be coded as marketing optimization, not asset transfer. Per our agreement, all future payments will be routed through the new VH Global portal." Bottom left, a flowchart. The strange money transfers I had been tracking for months. The ones I thought were just complex tax evasions. My grandfather's hidden system had been scraping my team's queries. It showed my dirty data in real time. The cash flow optimizations flowing in one direction, and a perfect matching river of funds flowing out to the VH Global Shell Company. The dates, times, and dollar amounts matched to the cent. My work. He had been using my own work as the tracking sensor. Vivian made a small, strangled sound. Then, the bottom right quadrant, which had been black, flared to life. It was high-definition video, the lobby, from tonight, from an angle I didn't know existed. Looking down as if from the ceiling, I saw myself. Standing there, I saw Vivian, her face contorted in a sneer. I saw her hand, adorned with the metal bracelet, swing up. I watched, clinically, as she struck me. The clack echoed in the boardroom, perfectly clear. And her voice, recorded by the microtransmitters, hissed through the speakers. No longer a whisper, but a public proclamation. "Just hysterical data. No one will ever believe you." The screen held on her face, twisted in that moment of triumphant cruelty. I understood. I finally understood. The trap wasn't built for me. It wasn't about me. The slap wasn't the reason. It was the catalyst. It was the final, non-financial, undeniable piece of evidence he needed. The gross abuse from my father's letter. The moral crisis from the bylaws. He had been building this cage for years. He knew Vivian's single, greatest weakness, her contempt for my father, and by extension, for me. He hadn't just hired me as an analyst. He had placed me on the board as a piece of bait. He had put his own granddaughter in the line of fire, trusting that Vivian's arrogance and cruelty would eventually, inevitably, make her pull the trigger. And she had, right under the all-seeing eye of his perfect, patient, digital trap. The 8K video wall held on the frozen image of Vivian's face, magnified 10 feet high, captured in the precise, ugly moment of her rage. The sound of the slap, and her subsequent threat, "No one will ever believe you," echoed in the tomb-like silence of the catalyst room. Vivian was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling. She was staring at her own monstrous reflection. Helen Carmichael and David Renway simply stared at her, their faces masks of cold judgment. My grandfather, Graham, ignored the screen. He glanced at his thin, elegant wristwatch. 8:21 p.m., right on schedule. He looked at Mr. Kincaid, the lead external counsel who had met us in the lobby. Mr. Kincaid, Phase 2, if you please. Wait, Vivian said, her voice a low growl. Wait, this is a setup. This is a private family matter. You can't. This, Helen Carmichael interrupted, her voice cutting through the air, stopped being a family matter the moment you used corporate assets to commit a crime. Vivian. Mr. Kincaid, who had been standing by the master console, tapped a command into his secure tablet. My grandfather looked at Vivian, and for the first time, his voice was completely devoid of its polite, elderly tremor. It was the clear, cold voice of the man who built this company. 3, he said. Vivian's eyes widened. What? 2? Graham, stop this. Whatever this is, stop it. 1? A heavy, definitive thud resonated through the room. So deep I felt it in my feet. It wasn't a sound in the room. It was the sound of the entire building's infrastructure changing state. The primary HVAC system shutting down, the secondary ventilation sealing. And then, the lights changed. The warm, ambient, expensive lighting that made the boardroom feel like a private club instantly snapped off. We were plunged into a half-second of pure, terrifying blackness. Then, a new set of lights snapped on. The crisis lighting grid I had seen on the 49th floor corridor. It was a flat, harsh, blue-white light, the kind used in surgical theaters and clean rooms. It left no shadows. It exposed every pore, every flicker of fear. A soft, electronic ping chimed, the same one from the lobby, but this time, it wasn't from a guard's radio. It was from the ceiling speakers. It was the all-hands, building-wide, public address system. You wouldn't, Vivian breathed, a new visceral panic entering her voice. You cannot. That is a secured channel. I control that channel. You controlled the public channel, my dear, Graham said, steepling his fingers. This is the emergency channel, and it answers to me. A faint crackle, and then a voice. Vivian's voice. It was not the recording from the lobby. This was different. It was casual, arrogant, and chillingly clear, captured by the same high-fidelity microphones that had recorded her threat to me. Listen, her amplified voice boomed, not just in our room, but simultaneously on every floor, in every office, in every elevator, and in the vast, empty, locked-down lobby. I don't care what the internal models say. The street expects a 4% beat, and we are going to give them a 4% beat. I've told you how to handle this. It's just cleaning the books. Reallocate the logistics overspend to the R&D special projects ledger. It's a non-accrual account. Graham never looks at it. Call it accelerated depreciation. Call it strategic realignment. I don't care what you call it. Just make the paper clean. I want this quarter's bonus locked by Monday. Am I understood? The recording was from 3 days ago, a private prep meeting she'd had with the accounting department heads. She was bragging. She was ordering them to commit fraud. I pictured the 34th floor, my team, the few who were working late. I pictured Sarah, my senior analyst, her hands freezing over her keyboard. I pictured the analysts in the finance department on 45, the ones who had been bullied into making those entries, their faces turning white. I pictured the clack of a dropped smartphone on a desk on the trading floor, the sudden, absolute, paralyzing silence of a 1,000-person company that had just heard, directly and undeniably, that the entire system was a lie. The PA system cut off. The silence that rushed back into the room was heavier, colder, and more absolute than the darkness had been. Vivian was shaking, her hand pressed to her mouth. You broadcast that, she whispered, horrified. Protocol Alder, Vivian, Graham said, his voice mild. It's an executive integrity review. It secures the data, and then it secures the witnesses. The entire building is now a witness. As he spoke, the massive, frosted glass doors at the end of the room slid open again. 2 more figures entered, walking with grim purpose. I recognized them instantly from the annual reports. Marcus Thorne and Dr. Aris, the other 2 independent members of the audit committee. the ones based in London and Zurich. They were followed by a third person, a sharp-looking woman in a dark gray suit I'd never seen before, carrying a heavy, combination-locked briefcase. She was not Granite Harbor Counsel. She radiated an aura of expensive, external, white-collar defense. Vivian's face, already pale, turned a sickly, chalky white. "Marcus? Aris?" she stammered. What are you doing here? Your flight wasn't until next week. You're supposed to be in Zurich." Marcus Thorne, a severe man with zero tolerance for incompetence, didn't even look at her. He looked at Helen Carmichael. "Helen, we're here." "We flew into Greyford 12 hours ago. Vivian," Helen explained, her voice sharp. "We've been at the airport hotel, waiting for Mr. Kincaid's signal, the one that told us the trap was sprung." The new woman stepped forward, placing her briefcase on the table. "My name is Anya Sharma," she said, her voice crisp, with a faint British accent. "I am from the firm of Wilmer Hale. As of 8:20 p.m. this evening, my firm has been retained by the independent committee members present to act as external counsel for the corporation in this matter. We are unconflicted." Vivian, cornered, finally found her voice. It was a brittle, desperate thing, but she latched onto her last, best defense. She laughed. It was a high-pitched, terrible sound. "This is insane," she said, looking around at the assembled board members. "This is a farce, a corporate coup, staged by a senile old man. That audio, that video of the lobby? You can't be serious." She pointed a trembling finger at the dark 8K wall. "Editing!" she almost shrieked. "It's called editing, deep fakes, AI. You think any of this is real? You think anyone will believe this? It's my word against a data file. You have no proof." No. She was grasping at the last straw. Plausible deniability in a world of digital fakes. Who could say what was real? My grandfather didn't even flinch. He looked at Mr. Kincaid, his expression one of mild boredom. "Mr. Kincaid, the evidentiary chain? She's concerned about editing." "Of course, Mr. Ellison," Kincaid said, his voice dripping with professional courtesy. He tapped his tablet again. The 8K wall, which had been dark, flared to life. It didn't show the video. It showed a cascading, endless column of cryptographic text, green letters and numbers, updating in real time. "This is a live feed from the evidentiary server. Ms. Ellison," Kincaid said, his voice narrating as if to a child. "Every audio and video file captured under Protocol Alder, from your speech in the lobby to the audio broadcast moments ago, was captured, encrypted, and instantly sealed with a unique, unalterable SHA-256 cryptographic hash." He pointed to the cascading text. "That hash is part of an unbroken chain, logged simultaneously on 3 separate, air-gapped servers. One is in this building, one is off-site, and the third is co-managed by my firm and Ms. Sharma's." Anya Sharma, the new lawyer, spoke up. "The chain of custody for every file is legally perfect. It is forensically identical to the standards required by the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Department of Justice." She let those names hang in the air. "It is not editing, Ms. Ellison. It is an immutable, admissible, digital confession. We are so far past plausible deniability that you can't even see it from here." The mention of the DOJ, spoken by an external lawyer in a crisis-lit room, finally shattered Vivian's composure. She stopped smiling. She stopped speaking. Helen Carmichael looked past her, past Graham, and her gaze landed on me. I was still standing by the console, my hand over my aching cheek. "Nora," Helen said. Her voice was firm, but not unkind. "Your turn. The dirty data. If you would." This was it. My heart was a hammer. My grandfather had built the stage, but I had supplied the script. I stepped back to the console. The GodView dashboard was still active on the monitor. "She's right," I said, my voice hoarse. "The video, the audio, that's the why. This," I said, my fingers flying across the virtual keyboard, "is the how." I clicked the master visualization tool. The entire 8K wall changed. It was no longer a feed of text. It was a clean, brutal, and horrifyingly simple flowchart. The VH Global chart I had seen a preview of, now fully rendered. It was my life's work. The dirty data she had told me to ignore, to scrub, to bury. Here it was, painted in colors so simple anyone could understand. A box on the far left, labeled in bold, Granite Harbor Operations, Logistics Overspend. A thick, pulsing line, colored blood red, flowed from it. That red line flowed into a box in the middle. R&D, Special Projects Ledger, the slush fund. A second line, colored bright blue, flowed out of that same R&D box. It flowed to a box on the far right, VH Global, Consulting Fees, her shell company. The visualization was animated, showing the flow of funds, quarter by quarter, for the last 3 years. Then, I pressed the final command. Correlate, CFO compensation. A new line appeared at the bottom of the screen. It was colored a bright, sickening gold. It was labeled V. Ellison, Quarterly CFO Efficiency Bonus. And as the timeline on the chart animated, the gold line, her bonus, moved in perfect, terrifying, unmistakable synchronization with the blue line, the money flowing to her shell company. My God, David Renway whispered, standing up to get a closer look. Helen Carmichael didn't need to. The efficiency bonus, she said, her voice filled with contempt. It was tied to cost-saving initiatives. She was creating the emergency overspend herself, fixing it on paper by hiding the loss in Graham's R&D budget, and then paying herself a massive bonus for her efficiency, all while funneling the original stolen funds to her private offshore account. It was a perfect closed loop of fraud. She was stealing the money, paying herself a bonus for stealing it, and using my team's projections to cover her tracks. Vivian said nothing. She just stared at the golden line, her line, the undeniable proof. She took a half step back, away from the table, away from the accusations, her hand blindly seeking the wall behind her. She was looking for an exit, a door, a way to escape. She bumped into the wall-mounted video conferencing unit, a black, spherical camera eye in the corner. I would advise you not to move, Ms. Ellison. Anya Sharma, the lawyer, said softly. As Vivian stumbled back another step, deeper into the corner, a single, tiny, ruby-red dot appeared on the chest of her pristine white silk blouse. She froze. She looked down at the dot, a small, perfect red laser point, centered directly over her heart. She looked up, terrified, at the spherical camera she had just bumped. It wasn't just a conferencing camera. Protocol Alder, Ms. Ellison, Mr. Kincaid explained, as if discussing the weather. It also includes positional tracking for all C-suite executives during an integrity review. We know where you are. We know where your phone is. We know where your workstation is. You are exactly where we need you to be. The red dot held steady, painting her not as an executive, but as an asset to be contained. She was trapped in the cold, white light, marked like a target, and she finally, understood that there was no way out. The red laser dot, that single, perfect, ruby-red point of containment, held steady on Vivian's chest. She was frozen in the corner, a specimen pinned against the wall, illuminated in the harsh, surgical, blue-white light of the boardroom. The 8K wall behind us glowed with the inescapable flowchart of her crimes, the red, blue, and gold lines that mapped her greed. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum, of a verdict reached before the jury had even spoken. My grandfather, Graham Ellison, was the first to break it. He looked away from Vivian, his expression no longer one of patient observation, but of final, cold authority. He glanced at Ms. Davies, the corporate secretary, who sat at the end of the table, her hands poised over a secure laptop. Ms. Davies, Please note the time, Graham said. His voice was formal, clipped. It is 8:27 p.m., she replied, her own voice a perfect, emotionless monotone. Let the record show that an extraordinary meeting of the Board of Directors of Granite Harbor Holdings, as convened by the Chairman Emeritus under the emergency authority of Corporate Bylaw 14A, is now in session. Graham nodded. And as stipulated by Bylaw 14A, Crisis of Confidence, this meeting hereby activates the full authority of Bylaw 17B, Emergency Succession and Governance. He looked briefly at Vivian, the red dot still burning on her blouse. The very bylaw you authored, Vivian, to consolidate your own power. How fitting. This is not a board meeting, Vivian hissed, her voice a low, desperate snarl. This is a mutiny. It's illegal. It is, to the contrary, meticulously legal. Anya Sharma, the external counsel, stated, not even looking up from her papers. All voting members of the Audit and Ethics Committees are present. A majority of shareholder votes is present by proxy. We have a quorum. The meeting is valid. Graham turned to the corporate secretary. Ms. Davies, before we proceed to the motions, please read the relevant articles from the Granite Harbor Holdings Officers' Code of Conduct, which all attendees in this room are bound by. Ms. Davies's fingers clicked on her keyboard. She read, her voice cutting through the tension, devoid of drama. Article 5, Section 2, Workplace Conduct. Any officer of the corporation found to have engaged in physical intimidation, threat, or battery against any employee, at any level, shall be subject to immediate disciplinary action, up to and including summary termination for cause. She paused, then continued. Article 9, Section 4. Fiduciary duty. Any action by a ranking officer found to constitute willful misrepresentation of financial data, gross negligence leading to corporate exposure, or self-dealing for personal enrichment shall be grounds for immediate removal from office and forfeiture of all non-vested compensation, pending a full external audit. The words, summary termination and forfeiture hung in the cold, sterile air. Thank you, Ms. Davies, Graham said. He turned to Mr. Kincaid, the other external counsel. Mr. Kincaid, please present Exhibit A for the board's official review. Presenting Exhibit A, Kincaid announced formally. Synchronous audio-video files captured under Protocol Alder, timestamp 8:03:14 p.m. to 8:03:55 p.m., sourced from Lobby Camera 14B, covert, and Executive Elevator E4, covert. The 8K wall, which had been displaying my flowchart, flickered. It was now a split screen. On the left, the high-definition, top-down view of the lobby. I saw my own head, the top of Vivian's, her hand raising, the brutal, quick clack of the bracelet against my cheek. On the right, a new feed. The inside of the elevator we had just ridden. It showed me, my back to the wall, my hand pressed to my face. It showed Vivian, staring at the door, her face a mask of fury. It showed my grandfather, silently watching us both. A small, red digital timecode, synchronized to the millisecond, ran in the corner of both video feeds. The evidence was seamless, the act, and the immediate, remorseful aftermath. This is, Vivian sputtered. This is a gross violation of my privacy. This is inadmissible. I will not stand for this. She took a step forward, her hand reaching for her phone. I demand to call my lawyer, my personal counsel. I will not say another word in this kangaroo court until my lawyer is present. She was desperate, grasping for any procedural straw. Anya Sharma, the corporation's lawyer, finally looked up, her gaze pinning Vivian to the spot. Ms. Ellison, you are an officer of this corporation, currently participating in a duly constituted emergency meeting of its board. You are not under arrest, and this is not a criminal proceeding. Her voice was polite, patient, and absolutely lethal. This is an internal corporate governance matter. for which the board requires your immediate attention. You have every right, as a private citizen, to seek personal counsel. You are, of course, free to leave this meeting at any time to make that call." She let the offer hang in the air. Vivian's eyes flickered to the door. "However," Ms. Sharma continued, "the board's fiduciary duty to protect the corporation from an active, ongoing crisis is immediate and paramount. Should you choose to leave, this meeting will continue, the evidence will be reviewed, and the votes will be held in your absence." It was a perfect trap. If she left, she was abandoning her post, admitting guilt, and giving up her right to speak. If she stayed, she was legitimizing the very meeting that was about to destroy her. Vivian's shoulders slumped. The fight went out of her, replaced by a dull, hollow dread. She slowly, mechanically, sank back into her chair. "Continue," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Very well," Graham said. He looked at Helen Carmichael. "Helen, the corporation is in crisis. The CEO is in flight over the Pacific and unreachable. The chief financial officer is compromised." His eyes flickered to Vivian. "The markets will open in 11 hours, and our emergency broadcast has likely already been leaked by an employee. We require a stabilization plan." Helen nodded, then looked directly at me. I was still standing by the console, my cheek a dull, hot, throbbing ache. "Nora," Helen said. Her voice was not unkind, but it was all business. "The committee asked you to prepare a contingency plan for this exact scenario. Please present it." This was the part I dreaded. I took a deep breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. I forced my hand to be steady as I tapped the console. My data, my plan. The 8K wall changed, replacing the video feeds with a simple, clean, text-based slide. Stabilization Directive, Phase 1. "The situation requires 3 immediate, parallel actions," I said, my voice hoarse, but gaining strength. I refused to look at Vivian. I spoke to the committee, to my grandfather. "Ying?" "Financial containment." I tapped the screen. "Effective immediately. I will work with the audit committee to sign a temporary blanket freeze on all non-payroll expenditures over $10,000. All corporate accounts will require dual signature approval from a member of the audit committee. This severs the cash flow to the VH Global Shell Company and any others we haven't found yet. 2. Operational integrity." I tapped again. "We must assume all recent financial reports are compromised. We will initiate a full, independent, third-party audit to be led by Ms. Sharma's firm and a forensic accounting team of her choice. They will be given unrestricted, root-level access to all servers, effective immediately." I took another breath. 3. Personnel protection. The PA broadcast was a necessary shock, but it has terrified our employees. We must secure their trust. I have drafted an all-company directive to be sent the moment this meeting concludes. It guarantees full, anonymous, and legally protected whistleblower status for any employee, at any level, who comes forward with information regarding financial irregularities or workplace intimidation. We turn the lights on, everywhere. We clean the books ourselves, from the bottom up. I finished. I stepped back from the console. The room was silent. David Renway, from Ethics, nodded slowly. "Clean, decisive. It protects the assets and the people." "A sound plan," Graham said. "But a plan requires authority." He reached for the thick, blue-bound stack of papers he had taken from the safe. The proxy votes. He placed them on the mahogany table with a soft, definitive thud. "We have 2 motions on the floor," Graham announced, his voice now resonating with the full power of his position. "Both motions have been put forth by the unanimous consent of the Independent Audit and Ethics Committees." Vivian looked up, her eyes narrowing. "A committee of 4? You don't have the votes. Graham, the rest of the board is loyal to me. This is a farce. You need a majority." "Ah, yes, the votes," Graham said. He tapped the thick blue proxy file. "I must apologize. Vivian, I haven't been entirely truthful these past few years. While you were consolidating your power, I was consolidating my shares. As of 8 p.m. this evening, all proxy agreements held in trust by me were activated. The Peterson estate, the Ohio Teachers Pension Fund, the Swiss investors. I hold, in my hand, 54% of all voting shares. The majority, you see, is already in this room. Vivian's face went completely, utterly blank with shock. First motion, Graham said, his voice like a gavel. A vote of no confidence in the chief financial officer, Vivian Ellison, and her immediate, temporary removal from all duties, titles, and access, pending the outcome of the external investigation. He looked at the committee members. Helen? Aye, Helen Carmichael said, her voice clear. David? Aye, David Renway said, his voice firm. Marcus? Aye. Aris? Aye. Graham looked at Vivian, his eyes cold. The chairman emeritus, holding the 54% majority proxy, votes aye. The motion passes unanimously. Ms. Davies, let the minutes reflect. Vivian Ellison is temporarily removed, effective immediately. The tiny red laser dot on Vivian's chest clicked off. She was no longer a target. She was irrelevant. Second motion, Graham continued, not missing a beat. To stabilize the corporation and execute the plan as presented, we require an emergency chief operating officer with full C-suite authority, as stipulated in Bylaw 17B. The committee nominates Nora Ellison. The blood drained from my face. I gripped the console to stay upright. All in favor? Graham asked the room. Aye, Helen. Aye, David. Aye, Marcus. Aye, Aris. Graham turned his gaze to me. The majority proxy votes aye. The motion passes. Ms. Davies, let the minutes reflect. Nora Ellison is appointed acting chief operating officer with all attendant authorities, effective immediately. The silence in the room was absolute. And that, finally, is what broke her. Not the fraud, not the proxies, not the removal. The promotion. No! Vivian's voice wasn't a word. It was a shriek. She lunged to her feet, her expensive chair scraping violently against the floor, crashing behind her. You cannot! She screamed. Her face purpled with a rage so profound it was terrifying. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me. Me? Her? You choose her? All her composure, all her icy control, shattered into a million pieces. She is a child, Vivian raged, her voice cracking. She's a tech. She's just a data kid. She just runs numbers. She is nothing. She was panting, her hands clenched, her entire body shaking. The board members just watched her, their faces impassive. I just stood there, my hands still on the console, my cheek throbbing, my heart a terrified bird in my chest. My grandfather watched her tirade until it subsided into ragged, gasping breaths. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He spoke softly, his words precise, like a surgeon closing an incision, each one falling like a drop of ice. You're right, Vivian, he said, his voice laced with an Arctic calm. She is a data kid. He paused, letting the silence stretch, forcing her to look at him. And for the last 3 years, he continued, his voice so quiet we all had to lean in, that data kid has been running the numbers on your game, and she just calculated its final day. She is nothing! Vivian's shriek echoed in the surgically lit boardroom, a raw, primal sound of disbelief and fury. The board members, the lawyers, all stared, impassive, as her composure, her life's work of icy control, detonated in front of us. She was panting, her hands clenched, her eyes fixed on me with a hatred so pure it was almost a physical force. And then, as suddenly as it began, the screaming stopped. A new expression flickered across her face. It was not defeat. It was calculation. A dark, sudden, terrifying smile spread across her lips, a rictus of pure malice. She laughed. It was not the shriek from before. It was a low, guttural, confident chuckle. "You old fool," she whispered, her voice dripping with newfound contempt. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking at Graham. "You? You really think this is it?" she sneered. "You think you've won? You with your little data kid and your moral majority?" She straightened up, smoothing her silk blouse, the red laser dot now gone, her authority flooding back into her. "I have a backup plan," she said, her voice soft and venomous. "I've always had a backup plan. You think I would build an empire and not have an escape route? You think I would leave my entire future in one set of books?" Helen Carmichael and David Renway exchanged a nervous glance. This was new. "You've forgotten. Graham," Vivian continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "You've forgotten about your safe, the chairman's safe, the original one, the one behind the painting of the guiding light in your old office." A cold dread settled in my stomach. The blackmail. This was the real play. "I know about it," she hissed. "I've known for years, and I know what's in it. Contracts you signed, Graham, back in the 90s, the aggressive accounting, the special arrangements with the unions, things that would make my creative invoicing look like child's play." She smiled, her eyes glittering. "You think this board will be so quick to anoint your granddaughter when I show them your dirty laundry? You'll destroy me. You'll destroy the entire company. You'll destroy your own name." She had him. It was a classic, mutually assured destruction scenario. The board members were frozen. My grandfather, Graham, did not flinch. He just looked at her, his expression one of almost profound disappointment. "Ah, yes," he said, his voice mild. "The safe behind the guiding light. A dreadful painting. I always knew it was the most obvious hiding place in the entire building." He sighed. "Vivian, I bought that painting in 1982. It's the first place a thief would look." He shook his head, a gesture of almost paternal pity. "That wasn't my safe. That was the decoy safe. It's the one I let you find. Years ago. I've been waiting for you to use it." Vivian's smile froze, the blood draining from her face. "I assumed," Graham continued, "that if you found it, you would use it to store your most valuable leverage, your blackmail, your insurance policy, the things you couldn't risk putting on a server." He nodded to the E-level security guard, Mr. Hansen, who still stood by the door. "Mr. Hansen, the audit committee's evidentiary safe, if you please, not the chairman's." Hansen didn't move toward the door. He walked to the long mahogany credenza that ran along the side wall of the boardroom, the one holding expensive-looking vases and shareholder reports. He pulled the entire heavy unit away from the wall with a quiet scrape. Behind it was another panel, another seamless square of rosewood, another biometric scanner. Hansen placed his own thumb on the scanner. There was a hiss of hydraulics, and a second, identical safe door swung open. Vivian stared at it, her mouth open. Hansen reached inside and withdrew another, single archival box, this one sealed with a deep blue wax. He handed it, not to Graham, but to Helen Carmichael. What is this?" Vivian stammered. "This," Helen said, her voice like Arctic ice, "is the real backup plan. This is Project Nightingale. Phase 2. The evidence you thought you had, and the evidence you didn't even know you'd lost." She broke the blue seal with her thumbnail and opened the box. She pulled out a thick sheaf of contracts, bound with a simple rubber band. "We recognize them, of course," Helen said, dropping them on the table. "Your employee transition program, the stock buyback agreements, the ones you so generously offered to employees who were leaving or who you'd forced out. This was one of her most lauded innovations, a program to buy back vested stock options from departing employees, offering them a lump sum of cash. It was seen as compassionate. In reality, it was a ruthless consolidation of her own power, using corporate funds to buy up shares for pennies on the dollar, all routed through her VH Global shell company. "It's all legal," Vivian snapped, her confidence wavering. "They signed They were happy to get the money. Oh, they signed, Helen agreed. But we wondered why you were so confident. Why you kept the physical, original copies in your decoy safe. So we borrowed them last week while you were in the London office. Mr. Kincaid, the external counsel, stepped forward. He took one of the contracts from the top of the pile. He pulled a small, pen-sized device from his breast pocket. It was a high-intensity UV light. If you could dim the crisis lights, Mr. Hanson, Kincaid said. Hanson tapped a wall switch. The harsh blue-white lights dimmed to a twilight gloom. The 8K wall was the only major source of light. Kincaid clicked on the penlight. A sharp, violet beam shot out. He shined it on the signature line of the contract. We could all see the employee's signature, scrawled in normal blue ink. But underneath it, glowing in a sickly, spectral, greenish yellow, was another signature. A ghost, hidden in the very fibers of the paper. "What in God's name is that?" David Renway whispered, standing up to get a closer look. "It's a UV reactive security ink," Kincaid explained, his voice the only sound in the dark room. Embedded in the paper before it was ever printed, the employee signed their name, but they were signing over a signature that was already there, a pre-signed, invisible counterparty. He slid the document under the desktop projector. The 8K wall flared to life, showing a magnified, high-contrast image of the signature line. The glowing yellow-green text was undeniable. It read, Ellison Family Trust, G. Ellison, Trustee. Vivian made a small, choking sound. "You weren't buying their stock for VH Global." "Vivian," my grandfather's voice cut through the darkness. "That was just the money laundering part. You were transferring the actual ownership, using a forged signature of my name on a trust you created illegally, all hidden by a simple, invisible ink trick." "It was a double fraud," Helen said, her voice filled with quiet disgust. "You stole the money from the company to pay the employee, and then you stole the stock from the employee, transferring it directly to a trust you controlled, all in one transaction, and you thought the decoy safe, with your pathetic blackmail material, was your protection." "That's not all," David Renway said, his voice heavy. He tapped his own secure tablet. Another audio file played, no video this time, just Vivian's voice, warm, casual, and utterly damning. No, Mark. Just bill the entire atrium build-out as system maintenance and repair. It's an operational expense. It just disappears. The capital expenditure budget is too tight. But the repair budget, hell, no one ever looks at the repair budget. We've been doing this for years. Don't get nervous now. The audio clicked off. "Mark," Helen clarified for the room, "is Mark Sarif, CEO of Apex Construction, your primary contractor for all build-outs, and as our investigators confirmed this morning, your brother-in-law." It was a cascade, an avalanche of proof, each piece more damning than the last. She hadn't just stolen, she had built an entire, interlocking parasitic ecosystem, with her at the center, draining the company from a dozen different wounds. Anya Sharma, the silent external counsel from Wilmer Hale, finally spoke. She slid a single, crisp, heavyweight piece of paper, folded in 3, across the polished mahogany table. It stopped directly in front of Vivian. "What is this?" Vivian whispered, staring at it as if it were a snake. "That, Ms. Sharma said, her voice crisp and final, "is a copy of the letter my firm, on behalf of the independent board members of Granite Harbor Holdings, has prepared. It is a formal declaration of voluntary cooperation. It's addressed to the U.S. Attorney's Office for this district. A courtesy copy is also prepared for the Securities and Exchange Commission, Division of Enforcement." The air in the room became so cold I could barely breathe. "The letter details," Sharma continued, "are preliminary findings of multi-year, systematic wire fraud, securities fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and significant violations of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. We are, in effect, handing the federal government the entire unredacted case, the SHA 256 hashes, the audio files, the video, the UV contracts, and Nora's flowchart. She paused. Our total cooperation, in exchange for stabilizing the company's future. The letter is time-stamped. It will be sent electronically the moment this meeting concludes. You're turning me in, Vivian gasped, the full weight of her reality finally crushing her. We are cleansing the company, Helen Carmichael corrected her, her voice like iron. This was it, the absolute end. And in that final, desperate moment, Vivian did the last thing she could. Her right hand flew to her left wrist, to the heavy, modernist, metal bracelet, the one she had struck me with. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a key. She jammed her thumb onto the main clasp and twisted it, hard, counterclockwise. It wasn't a panic button, it was a kill switch, a clean slate protocol. She was trying to torch the servers. A deafening, obnoxious, klaxon-like beep, beep, beep erupted from the console in front of me. The 8K wall, which had been showing the contract, flashed a violent, pulsing red. Security override attempted. Biometric key. CFO Alpha. Action blocked by Protocol Alder. Vivian stared at the screen, horrified. She twisted the bracelet again. Beep, beep, beep. Did you really think we didn't know about that, too? Graham sighed, his voice heavy with her predictability. Project Nightingale. We saw the purchase order for the remote signal device. We saw the code. We've been waiting for you to use that, as well. The red screen vanished, replaced by a simple, calm, blue input box. Protocol Alder active. Clean slate. Requires final E-level verification. Enter override PIN. Vivian glared at the screen, her hand still clutching her useless bracelet. I don't have that PIN. You have that PIN. Graham, it's your protocol. Yes, it is, Graham said softly. The final failsafe, the last lock on the last door. I had to choose a PIN that I knew, with absolute certainty. You would never, ever guess. A sequence of numbers you would never think to look for, never deem important. He turned his head, his ancient, calculating eyes finally leaving Vivian. He looked at me. The anger was gone. The calculation was gone. All that was left was a deep, profound sadness. The PIN, he said, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, is your birthday, Nora. My heart stopped. I couldn't breathe. What? Vivian's voice was a bare, choked gasp. The day you were born, Graham said, his gaze holding mine. The one good thing my son brought into this world. The one thing in this company he truly loved. That's the key. That's the final lock. She can't destroy what he helped build. He nodded to the console. Nora, Acting Chief Operating Officer, please, secure the company. I was shaking. I looked from my grandfather's mournful face to Vivian's, which was now a grotesque mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She was staring at me, finally realizing that she was never the queen. She was just a virus, and I was the antivirus. My hands, slick with cold sweat, moved to the keyboard. I typed the 8 digits, my birth date. I pressed enter. The 8K wall flashed a solid, calming green. E-level verification accepted. N. Ellison, Acting COO. Clean slate. Protocol permanently disabled. All evidentiary servers secured and locked. All CFO-level access. Biometric and digital. Permanently revoked. It was over. She had no money, no power, no data, no escape. Vivian slumped. She didn't fall. She just deflated. The steel rod that held her upright, the one made of arrogance and greed, simply dissolved. A soft ding echoed from the hallway, the sound of the service elevator arriving, once again, on the 49th floor. Anya Sharma checked her watch. 8:34 p.m. They're punctual. The boardroom doors slid open. 2 people stepped inside, a man and a woman. They were not in uniform. They were wearing simple, unremarkable, off-the-rack suits that looked like they'd been slept in. They looked like mid-level accountants, tired, bored, and overworked. But they carried themselves with an authority that was not corporate. It was federal. "Ms. Sharma?" the woman asked, her voice flat. "Agent Devereaux," Sharma said, nodding. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. This is a secure room." The two agents' eyes swept the room. They scanned the board members. They glanced at my grandfather's cane. They looked at me, and their eyes paused for a fraction of a second on the swollen, purpled mark on my cheek. Their gaze finally settled on Vivian. She was still slumped in her chair, staring at the green, "Access Revoked" message on the 8K wall. Agent Devereaux stepped forward, her footsteps silent on the carpet. "Vivian Ellison?" she asked, her voice polite, as if she were just arriving to pick someone up from the airport. Vivian didn't look up. "Ma'am," the agent said, a little firmer, her voice cutting through the silence. "I'm Agent Devereaux. This is Agent Pace, Financial Crimes Division. We'd like to ask you a few questions. Downtown." The two federal agents, Devereaux and Pace, stood just inside the boardroom, their presence sucking all the corporate authority from the air, replacing it with something colder, heavier, and non-negotiable. They were a different species of power. They were not here to negotiate. "Vivian Ellison?" Agent Devereaux repeated, her voice flat, as Vivian remained slumped, a marionette with her strings cut. Agent Pace moved, not with a rush, but with a casual, practiced deliberation. He walked around the long mahogany table, his eyes never leaving Vivian, his hand never far from his belt. The finality of it, the arrival of an external, inescapable reality, seemed to reboot Vivian's system. The hollow dread was replaced by one last, flickering ember of her former self, pure, reptilian pride. She stood up. She did not wait for Agent Pace to reach her. She stood, pulling the tattered remnants of her composure around her like a shield. She straightened her silk blouse, the one now marked by a ghost of a laser dot. She was still, in her own mind, the chief financial officer of Granite Harbor Holdings. "I am Vivian Ellison," she said, her voice a dry rasp, but it was hers. She did not walk toward the agents. She turned, her back to them, to the board, to me. She walked, her heels clicking a sharp, solitary rhythm on the marble inlay, toward the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows. The 8K wall was dark. The harsh, blue-white crisis lights were off, replaced now by a standard, dimmer, ambient glow. Outside, the rain had eased to a fine, silver mist, but the city of Grayford was a billion points of light, blurred and distant. With the bright, accusatory lights of the boardroom extinguished, the massive window, cooled by the night air, had become a perfect, black mirror, reflecting the entire room with flawless, chilling clarity. Vivian stopped, inches from the glass. She stared. I watched her, standing from my place at the console. I could see her, and I could see her reflection. She was staring at a tableau of her own destruction. In the glass, she saw herself, a woman of impossible power, now flanked by the blurred, indistinct shapes of the federal agents approaching from behind. And just over her shoulder, deeper in the reflection, she saw me. I was standing, my hand resting on the console that had been her undoing. The dark, swollen, purpled mark on my cheek was starkly visible, even in the reflection. She saw the victor and the vanquished, framed together in one perfect, cold rectangle. She saw the data kid who had just inherited the kingdom, and the queen who had just been exiled. She saw, I thought, a tower built on sand. She had built it with such precision, such arrogance, never once imagining that the foundation, the data, the bylaws, the very people she dismissed, would be the thing to give way. And now, the tide had come in, and it was all washing away. She spoke, her voice so low it was almost inaudible, addressed not to me, but to my reflection, her ghostly twin in the glass. What did you want? It was not a question. It was a demand for a motive that she could understand. Agent Devereaux, now just a few feet behind her, paused, giving this last strange confession room to breathe. Was this it? Vivian's eyes flickered in the glass, meeting mine. This whole, elaborate, insane performance, the old man's magic tricks, the spies, the drama. She turned her head slightly, her voice thick with a contempt so deep it was almost pity. You could have just asked for a raise, Nora. Her gaze swept over the dark, multi-million-dollar room. Or did you want this? The title? The chair? The office? Did you want to be me? She still didn't get it. She never would. She was a creature of pure acquisition. She could not comprehend a motive that did not involve money or power. To her, this was just a hostile takeover, a palace coup. My cheek throbbed, a dull, hot pulse, reminding me of the clack of her bracelet. No, Vivian, I said, and my voice was surprisingly steady. It was hoarse, exhausted, but it was clear. I never wanted to be you. I never wanted your money, and I never wanted your title. I pushed myself away from the console, stepping out from behind the machinery, into the open. I wanted the numbers to be real. She stared at my reflection, uncomprehending. I wanted the people on my team, I continued. The ones in the windowless rooms, the analysts you called grunts, the ones who work until 2 a.m. trying to make your projections match reality. I wanted them to be able to do their jobs without being bullied, without having their KPIs changed as a punishment, without being terrified that telling the truth would get them fired. I took a step closer, until my reflection stood almost beside hers in the glass. You asked what I wanted, I said, my voice hardening. I want the people who work in this building to be safe doing the right thing. That's it. You made integrity a fireable offense. You made the truth a liability. I just wanted to make it the standard. Vivian's reflection sneered, a faint, ugly twist of her lips. Safe, she spat, as if the word itself was offensive. You did all of this destruction, for safety? You are a fool. You're a sentimental, pathetic little fool, just like your father. A shadow moved, my grandfather. He had walked silently up beside me, his hand, warm, dry, and heavy with the weight of decades, came to rest on my shoulder. It wasn't just a gesture of comfort, it was a gesture of alignment, a public, final declaration. She is not a fool, Vivian. Graham's voice was quiet, but it filled the space between us. She is just playing a different game than you, a better one. He looked at our reflections, at the 3 generations of Ellisons caught in the glass. You were right about one thing. Nora just runs the numbers. She operates by a set of rules, logic, truth, you operate by deception and brute force. His hand tightened on my shoulder. She set the rules for her game, and I just turned on the lights so we could all watch you play yours. That finally broke her cold stare. She spun around, her face a mask of livid, final hatred, to face him. The federal agents tensed, but she only had words left. You smiled, she hissed, her voice a venomous spray. In the lobby, when I hit her, you stood there, and you smiled. It was her last bullet, her final accusation, trying to drag him down into the mud with her, to prove he was just as monstrous as she was. My grandfather did not flinch. He did not deny it. He met her gaze, and his eyes were as cold and clear as the glass wall behind her. Yes, he said, I did. Vivian's face faltered, her accusation rendered inert by his simple, immediate admission. I smiled. Graham continued, his voice a low, precise, surgical instrument. Because in that single, arrogant, idiotic moment, you finally, did what I had been waiting 3 years for you to do. He took a step forward, forcing her to take a step back, right into the personal space of the federal agents. I did not smile because you hit my granddaughter, Vivian. I smiled because, in doing so, you provided the moral turpitude clause. I smiled because you were so blinded by your own cruelty that you confessed, on a live, encrypted, multi-angle video feed to half the building and a team of external lawyers. His voice dropped to a whisper, a final, devastating judgment. I smiled because that slap wasn't an assault. It was your signature. On a confession you were too stupid to realize you were writing. Vivian had no answer. There was no answer. She just stared at him, her chest heaving, her entire world, her entire sense of self, dismantled and exposed by the man she had dismissed as a senile relic. Agent Devereaux stepped forward, moving between them. The time for corporate justice was over. "Vivian Ellison," she said, her voice now hard, official, and loud in the quiet room. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and securities fraud." She motioned to Agent Pace, who moved to take Vivian's arms. "You have the right to remain silent," Devereaux continued, her voice a flat, practiced cadence that cut through the high-stakes drama like a buzzsaw. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be provided for you." As she spoke, Agent Pace gently, but with undeniable force, pulled Vivian's hands behind her back. Vivian didn't resist. She was hollow. I heard a small, sharp click, a plastic zip. Not steel. They were using disposable plastic cuffs, a quiet, clinical, humiliating restraint. And as her hands were secured, I heard one last, tiny, metallic sound. Jingle, jingle. It was the sound of her heavy, modernist, metal bracelet, the weapon she had used on me, lankly scraping against the cheap plastic of the federal restraints. The sound of her power, now just a useless, noisy trinket. Her hands, I saw, were trembling violently. While the agents began the quiet, procedural march of leading her out, I turned back to the console. The green, access revoked message was still glowing faintly, a final epitaph. I found the master display control and pressed it. The screen went black. The room plunged into a deeper shadow, lit now only by the ambient light from the hallway and the millions of distant, indifferent lights of the city outside. The reflection on the glass wall, of me, of my grandfather, of the board members, faded, becoming transparent. The mirror was a window again. But one light remained. In the far corner of the room, near the ceiling, a single, tiny, pinprick of light glowed, a deep, persistent, ruby red, the eye of the camera, no longer tracking, no longer a laser, just recording, a silent, digital witness to the end of an empire and the beginning of whatever came next. My grandfather watched them go, his face unreadable in the dim light. The heavy glass doors of the catalyst room slid shut, muffling the sound of their footsteps. The remaining board members, Helen, David, Marcus, Aris, stood, gathering their papers. They looked at me. Helen Carmichael gave a single, curt nod. It wasn't congratulatory, it was a confirmation. Acting COO. "The work begins now," they filed out, followed by the lawyers, Sharma and Kincaid, their briefcases snapping shut. Soon, the room was empty. It was just me and my grandfather, surrounded by the ghosts of the night. The silence was vast. He stood in the center of the room, leaning on his walnut cane. He looked at the dark 8K wall, then at the window, then at me, the swollen, purpled mark on my face. He raised his cane, just an inch off the plush carpet, and brought it down. Thump. A single, soft, definitive sound, an exclamation point, a period at the end of a very, very long sentence. "The game," he said, his voice quiet, and for the first time, sounding his age, "is over." The red laser dot was gone. The 8K wall was black. The federal agents had guided Vivian out of the room, and the heavy glass doors of the catalyst room had hissed shut, leaving a vacuum in their wake. The remaining occupants, the 4 independent board members, the 2 external lawyers, the corporate secretary, my grandfather, and I, did not speak. The adrenaline of the confrontation, the high stakes, rapid-fire detonations of fraud, blackmail, and moral failure had evaporated. What was left was the cold, sterile, and procedural reality of what we had just done. We had decapitated the company to save its life. "Ms. Davies," Graham said, his voice quiet in the vast room. He was no longer the puppet master. He was the chairman emeritus, resuming his duties. The corporate secretary, who had been a silent, efficient witness, nodded. "Mr. Chairman, let us make this final and binding," he said. The board members, Helen, David, Marcus, and Eris, who had stood when the agents entered, returned to their seats at the table. They did not look relieved. They looked burdened. This was not a victory. It was a catastrophic failure of governance that they now had to contain. "Ms." Davies turned to her secure laptop, her fingers flying. "I have prepared the formal, analog minutes for signature, reflecting the two motions passed by the unanimous vote of this emergency committee, holding a 54% proxy majority." She stood and retrieved a heavy, leather-bound ledger from a locked drawer in the credenza. It was the real corporate record, the one that existed beyond servers and kill switches. She opened it to a fresh page, already imprinted with the company's seal. "The motions," she read, her voice formal, "are 1. The immediate temporary removal of Vivian Ellison from the post of Chief Financial Officer and all attendant duties, access, and authorities, pending a full external investigation, and 2. The immediate temporary appointment of Nora Ellison to the post of Acting Chief Operating Officer, with full C-suite authority to manage the corporation's stabilization, effective immediately." She uncapped a heavy dark blue fountain pen, the board pen. I recognized it from my father's desk, used only for binding resolutions, and placed it on the ledger. "Helen," Graham said. Helen Carmichael, head of the audit committee, picked up the pen. Her hand was steady. She signed her name with a sharp, decisive, upward stroke. She did not hesitate. She passed the pen to David Renway. He signed, his signature slower, heavier, as if he felt the weight of the ink. Marcus and Eris followed, their movements quick, efficient. Then, "Ms." Davies slid the heavy ledger down the polished mahogany table to my grandfather. He picked up the pen. His hand, which I had seen tremble slightly with age, was rock solid. He signed Graham Ellison at the bottom. It was not a signature. It was an anchor, a restaking of a claim he had almost lost. He had just signed his own granddaughter into a position of impossible power, built on the wreckage of his son's widow. The ink was a dark, permanent blue on the cream-colored, heavyweight paper. It was done. While the ink dried, the lawyers, Mr. Kincaid and Ms. Sharma, moved with a different, colder precision, the procedural cleanup. "Mr. Hanson," Kincaid called to the security chief, who stood by the door. Hanson stepped to the first safe, the one behind the rosewood panel, the one Graham had opened. He closed the heavy steel door. It seated with a dull, final thunk. Kincaid produced a wide, red tamper-proof evidence tape roll from his briefcase. He ran a strip across the seam of the safe door, pressing it down hard. He did the same for the second safe, the decoy-turned trap that Hanson had opened behind the credenza. "Chain of custody," Kincaid narrated, as he signed his name across the red tape with a black marker, adding the date and the time, 8:41 p.m. 2 corporate safes, sealed by external counsel, pending full forensic audit. Helen Carmichael, meanwhile, was at the table, placing the archival boxes, the proxy votes, the Nightingale files, the UV light contracts, back into their containers. She did not hand them to Kincaid. She walked them over to Agent Devereaux and Agent Pace, who had returned from escorting Vivian and were now waiting by the door. "Agent Devereaux," Helen said, formally, "this is the preliminary physical evidence as discussed. The full digital copy is being prepared." Devereaux accepted the boxes. It was a simple, clean, Corporate to federal handoff. My dirty data, my grandfather's meticulous traps, all of it. Now just evidence. Ms. Davies, Graham said. The corporate secretary looked up from her laptop, where she had been typing furiously. Mr. Chairman? The press release? It is time. Yes, sir, she said. She clicked her mouse 3 times. The release has been sent. Wire services, all internal servers, and our public-facing media portals. I knew, instinctively, what it would say. It would be a masterpiece of corporate understatement, scrubbed clean of all the blood and betrayal. Granite Harbor Holdings announces executive leadership transition. Vivian Ellison has stepped down, effective immediately, to pursue other opportunities. The board of directors has unanimously appointed Nora Ellison, head of analytics, as acting chief operating officer. A leadership transition, the most brutal public execution in the company's history, reduced to 3 sterile antiseptic sentences, the final, perfect scrub, and this time, it was the truth. The room was finished. The board members stood, their briefcases snapping shut. They filed out, nodding curtly at my grandfather, their gazes sliding over me with a new, terrifying weight. I was no longer the data kid. I was the acting COO. I was the one they would be reporting to in the morning. Mr. Hansen, the security chief, was the last to approach. Save for my grandfather. He had been with the company for 40 years. He had been my father's bodyguard on trips. He looked at me, his face impassive, but his eyes. There was a deep, quiet sadness in them. He held out his hand. In his palm was not my old blue analytics ID badge. It was a new one. It was solid black, sleek, and felt heavy, like polished stone or cold metal. It had no photo. It had the gold Granite Harbor crest, and 2 words, etched in stark white. Acting Kiu. Below that, a single name, N. Ellison. I held out my hand, which I realized was still trembling, slick with the cold sweat of adrenaline. My cheek was a hot, swollen, painful mass. He placed the new card in my palm. The metal was shockingly, painfully cold. It was a jolt, a thermal shock against my hot, damp skin. It was the coldest, heaviest thing I had ever held. It was the weight of 5,000 employees, of a billion-dollar balance sheet, of a stabilization plan I had written as a theoretical exercise and now had to execute in reality. Vivian, Hansen said, his voice a low rumble. Protocol Alder is being disengaged. The building lockdown is lifted. The building is yours. He bowed, slightly, and stepped back. My grandfather and I were the last to leave. We stepped out of the catalyst room, the heavy glass doors hissing shut behind us, sealing the scene of the execution. The 49th floor corridor was no longer empty. The PA broadcast, the sudden, violent lockdown, the rumors, the sight of federal agents, C-suite executives, the ones who lived in these offices, were emerging. VPs of marketing, heads of legal, the SVPs who had reported directly to Vivian. They were standing in their doorways, their faces pale, their expensive suits rumpled. They didn't look at my grandfather. They looked at me. They looked at the raw, purple, violent mark on my face, and they looked at the new, black, TUU level card clutched in my hand. No one spoke. No one applauded. This wasn't a celebration. It was a seismic shift. It was the silent, terrifying calculation of a new power structure solidifying, in real time, right in front of them. Their eyes were the only sound. A collective gaze of fear, of assessment, and I saw it in a few of them, a quiet, profound relief. They were no longer afraid of her. They were now, very carefully, assessing me. As we reached the service elevator, the one that had brought us up to this floor, the doors slid open. Agent Devereaux, Agent Pace, and Vivian were inside. They were taking her down, through the secure exit, bypassing the lobby. Vivian stood between them, her head held high, She did not look like a woman defeated. She looked like a queen, unbowed. Even as she was being led to the gallows, she would not give us the satisfaction of her collapse. She walked past me, so close I could smell her cold, expensive perfume. She did not look at me. She did not look at my grandfather. She stared straight ahead, at the wall of the elevator. Her hands were cuffed behind her back, and the heavy modernist metal bracelet. It was silent. For the first time all night, it made no sound. Its power was gone. Its song was over. Just a useless, heavy piece of metal. The doors slid shut. The ding of the elevator signaled its descent. She was gone. The corridor was silent again. The executives had vanished back into their offices, to their phones, to begin the process of surviving. My grandfather and I were alone. And then, in the silence, a buzz. A vibration. In my pocket, my personal phone, the world, the real world, rushing back in. I pulled it out, my thumb clumsy on the screen. It was a new message, from the private, encrypted chat group I kept with my senior analytics team, the Dirty Data Group. The sender was Sarah, my team lead. The message was 5 words. The PA system, we heard, we're here. Not congratulations, not what happened, just we're here. The simple, absolute, uncomplicated loyalty of the trenches. I felt a sudden, hot sting behind my eyes, an emotion so powerful it threatened to undo me. More than the slap, more than the fear, more than the victory. This was the foundation. This was the why. I put the phone back in my pocket, my hand closing around the cold, hard, new keycard. My grandfather, who had watched this entire silent exchange, leaned heavily on his cane. "Come, Nora," he said, his voice softer now, the iron authority replaced by the familiar, dry warmth of the man who had taught me chess. "We have one last safe to open." I looked at him, confused. My mind raced. Another contingency? Another layer to this endless, exhausting game? "Another one, sir?" He shook his head, a small, sad smile playing on his lips. "No, not one of mine." He started walking, slowly, toward the main executive elevator, the one Vivian's card had failed to open. He expected me to follow. I looked down at the black card in my hot, trembling hand. I looked at the dark, silent corridor, which was now, terrifyingly, mine to command. And I understood. He didn't mean a physical safe, not one of steel and biometrics. The last safe was me. It was the one I had built inside myself for 17 years, the one where I had locked away my voice, my anger, my father's memory, my own name. I had hidden behind the data kid persona, behind the numbers, behind the safety of being invisible, terrified of the power and the pain that came with being an Ellison. Tonight, my grandfather hadn't just exposed Vivian. He had systematically, piece by piece, dismantled my own defenses. He had forced me to speak, to act, to own the data, to own the solution. The emergency succession wasn't just for the company, it was for me. The PIN code? My birthday, the final key. He had been telling me, in his own cryptic, ruthless way, that it was time to finally open it, that I couldn't be just the data kid anymore. He was waiting by the elevator. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my lungs, the hot throb on my cheek a grounding, painful reminder. I closed my hand around the cold, new card, and for the first time, it didn't feel heavy. It just felt mine. The next morning, the city was a watercolor of gray and silver. A thin, cleansing rain washed the glass of the Granite Harbor headquarters. I stood on the mezzanine level, inside the glass-walled catalyst room, but this was not the sealed, cold tomb of the night before. Today, the crisis lighting was gone, replaced by a clean, bright, morning white. The massive, soundproof glass walls, which had been frosted for the execution, were now perfectly, terrifyingly transparent. Below me, in the vast, 5-story main atrium, The company was gathered. Not all 5,000, but hundreds. The senior managers, the VPs, the department heads, the analysts, the administrative staff. They were a sea of pale, upturned faces. They were terrified. The press release had hit their inboxes at 6:01 a.m. The building-wide broadcast had been the subject of 1,000 frantic, encrypted text messages all night. They knew there had been a war. They had just found out who won. I walked to the simple, black podium. The mark on my cheek was a dark, swollen, purple testament. I had refused to cover it with makeup. It was a violation. Yes. But now, it was a uniform. It was the physical evidence of the moral crisis that had triggered everything. I saw them. I saw the VPs who used to look through me, now studying me with a new, reptilian focus. I saw the finance managers who had enabled Vivian, their faces pale with the dread of the coming audit. And I saw my team, my old team, standing in a small, tight cluster. Sarah, my senior analyst, looked up, and her eyes were not triumphant. They were fierce. She nodded. Once. In the front row, directly below me, sat my grandfather. He was just Graham Ellison, chairman emeritus. His hands were folded, resting on the carved wolf's head of his cane. The cane was just a cane. The silver inlay was just silver. The pinprick sensor at its base was dark. Its work was done. He was not here as a puppet master. He was here as a witness. I tapped the microphone. A soft, digital thump echoed through the massive, silent atrium. "Good morning," I said. My voice was hoarse, raw, but it did not tremble. "My name is Nora Ellison. I am the acting chief operating officer of Granite Harbor Holdings." I let the title, and my name, my real name, hang in the air. This was the first time for most of them. I was no longer N. Ellison, the data kid, the kiddo. For a long time, I continued, my voice gaining strength. This company has been run from a locked safe, a place where data was hidden, where numbers were manipulated, and where people were silenced, a place where the truth was considered dirty and loyalty was measured by your willingness to bury it. I looked out over the crowd, my gaze sweeping from the finance department to the legal team. "Last night, that safe was opened." A collective held breath. "We didn't open it to find money," I said, my voice cutting through the silence, echoing the words I had heard in my own head. "We opened it to find the truth, and we did. The truth is that our foundations were compromised. The truth is that fraud is not a strategic realignment, and the truth is that intimidation is not a management style." I paused. "That ends. Today. Right now." Beside me, at a small, formal table, sat Ms. Davies, the corporate secretary. She had not slept. She looked as efficient and precise as she had at midnight. In front of her were 2 documents and the heavy, blue-inked board pen. This was the new law. "Effective immediately," I announced. "I am signing 2 directives. They are the new foundation. They are not negotiable." I moved to the table. I picked up the pen. Directive 001, the Whistleblower Protection and Data Integrity Act. It guarantees full, anonymous, and legally protected status for any employee, who comes forward with evidence of financial irregularity or workplace misconduct. From this moment on, telling the truth is your primary job. My hand, the one that had been shaking just hours before, was rock solid. I signed my name, Nora Ellison, with a sharp, clean stroke. The sound of the nib on the heavy paper was a distinct, satisfying scratch. Directive 002, authorization for a full, independent, third-party forensic audit of all corporate ledgers, projects, and vendor contracts. Retroactive 5 years. We are turning on all the lights. We will find every optimization, every consulting fee, every hidden ledger, and we will scrub this company clean, from the server room to the boardroom. I signed the second document. Scratch? Done? I turned back to the microphone. There will be changes. They will be difficult, but they will be fair. The work we do here is too important to be built on a foundation of lies. Your work is too important. That is all. I didn't wait for applause. There was none. It was not a speech for applause. It was a statement of regime change. It was met with a deep, profound, and terrified silence. The silence of 1,000 people recalculating their entire careers, their alliances, their futures. I turned from the podium, as if on a prearranged cue. The massive 30-foot-high glass doors that separated the atrium from the main lobby hissed open. A wall of noise hit me. The cold, damp, morning air rushed in, carrying with it the chaotic, percussive click, 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 flash, flash, click of dozens of cameras, the press. They had been allowed into the lobby, held back at a velvet rope, and the moment I stepped off the mezzanine, they erupted. Ms. Ellison? Nora, what happened to Vivian Ellison? Are the feds in the building? Is Granite Harbor insolvent? What happened to your face? Ms. Ellison? Who's in charge of the company? Hanson, the security chief, was there, flanked by 2 new, grim-faced men I didn't recognize. My new detail. They formed a silent wedge around me as I descended the glass staircase into the main lobby. The flashes were blinding, a disorienting strobe effect. The shouting was a tidal wave of accusations. I kept walking. I did not look at them. I was focused on the revolving doors, the gray, rain-slicked street outside. A reporter, a woman from the Financial Times, broke past the rope, shoving a microphone in my face, blocking my path. Hanson moved to intercept, but I put up a hand. I stopped. The entire lobby, the entire press corps, went silent. The reporter, breathless, asked the one simple question. Ms. Ellison, what is your first order of business as COO? What happens now? I looked directly at her. I let her, and the dozens of cameras behind her, see me clearly. I let them see the raw, purple, violent evidence of the old regime on my cheek. I let them see the cold, exhausted, and absolutely unbroken resolve in my eyes. We have work to do, I said. My voice was quiet, but in the sudden, vast silence, it carried. I didn't say another word. I turned, and my detail reformed around me. I walked. As I passed the front row, I saw my grandfather. He was standing now, leaning on his cane. He had not joined the scrum. He was just watching me. As I passed, our eyes met. His were not the cold, calculating eyes of the puppet master. They were not the sad, mournful eyes of the man who had laid the trap. They were just warm, as they had been, once, a lifetime ago, when I was a child, before Vivian, before the data, before the game. He saw me, not the acting COO, not the data kid, just Nora. He nodded, a single, slow, profound acknowledgement, a passing of a torch that had burned for 50 years. I nodded back. Once, I turned away, and I did not look back. I did not look back at him, at the press, at the sea of terrified employees in the atrium. I walked out of the lobby, my new detail flanking me, and headed for the executive elevator bank. This building, this tower of glass and steel, had been a fortress. For a decade, it had been her fortress, a place of silent, cold, icy control. Before that, it had been his, a fortress of bylaws and secrets. It was not a fortress anymore. It was just a building. It was a house that needed to be cleaned, from the basement server to the 49th floor penthouse, and I had the keys. We rode the private executive elevator in silence, the one that, just 12 hours before, had denied Vivian access. The doors opened onto the 49th floor. The air was still, cold. The VPs who had been lurking in their doorways last night were gone, no doubt scrambling to their teams, trying to spin the narrative, to save themselves. I walked down the long, silent, carpeted corridor, past the catalyst room, now dark and empty. I walked until I reached the end of the hall. The massive, polished rosewood doors of the corner office, her office. my office. I stopped. Beside the door was the sleek, black biometric security panel, the one that, I knew, was tied to her bracelet, the one that was now useless. I reached into my pocket, my hand closed around the new ID card, the black, heavy, cold piece of metal. My hand was steady. I placed the card against the reader. There was no sound, just a brief, electronic pause. Then, a single, soft, permissive beep. The small indicator light on the panel turned from red to a solid, definitive, brilliant green. A heavy thunk echoed in the silent hall as the magnetic lock released. The door was open. Black screen. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I truly hope you enjoyed it. We pour our hearts into these narratives, and the best part is sharing them with you. I'm so curious to know where you're listening from. Please, drop a comment below and let us all know what part of the world you're tuning in from, and share your thoughts on Nora's journey. Let's build a community right here. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. And if you really loved it and want to help us reach more people, please hit that hype button. It makes a huge difference and ensures these stories get heard by as many people as possible. Thank you again for being here. We'll see you in the next one.